And we are live. Yep. Okay. Awesome. Hello, all the humans. Welcome to the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix Sunday Speaker event. Please hit the like button and subscribe to get more of our awesome content, or better yet, become a member of HSGP and volunteer for something that fills you with joy. Today, we have Will Humble with COVID, the Unvarnished Play-by-Play. Will Humble is the Executive Director of the Arizona Public Health Association. His 30 years in public health include more than 2 decades at the Arizona Department of Health Services, where he served in various capacities, including the agency director from 2009 to 2015. Most recently, he served as a health policy director at the University of Arizona from 2015 to 17, and continues to be involved in health policy in his role with AZPHA and the adjunct faculty at the University of Arizona's Mel and Edith Zuckerman College of Public Health. He received a Bachelor in Science in Marketing from Northern Arizona University, a Bachelor of Science in Microbiology from Arizona State University, and a Master's in Public Health from the University of California, Berkeley. He was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Arizona in 2015 for his career commitment to engaging partnerships between academic and executive public health. Mr. Humble strongly believes in the use of science-based health policy as a means of improving health outcomes, and strives to lead and manage with emotional intelligence, for which I thank him greatly. With that, I would like to turn it over to Will Humble. Sir.
Thanks, Ron, and thanks for the invitation again. Hi, everybody. I think this might be our second or third in the last couple of years. I think maybe the last time we talked about vaccines. I'm not 100% sure. And you left out one thing, a proud member of HSGP. That's on my bio too. I didn't put it's on a website, but okay. So I thought what I would do today, what I want to do is to cover the last couple of years from a policy perspective, both the things that were, the decisions that were good, the decisions that were poor, the decisions that lacked ethical constructs, a little bit about operational problems, but mostly I want to focus on policy. So I'm prepared to do that. But what I thought I'd do first, since the topic came up about the community center and timing and so forth, I thought I'll just switch up what I was planning to do a little bit and give an update like on the current situation, where we are, with a little bit of forecast for where I think we might be in a couple of months. And that might be helpful for you all as you think through reopening the community center and so forth. So I do want to share my screen a bit for this portion of it. So Ron, can I do that?
Yep, hang on just a second. Let me get you permissions, and you now have permissions.
Okay, so I'm going to take you first to my blog. I'm with the Arizona Public Health Association. This is our blog website. This is my blog from yesterday. I'm just the introduction, like the decisions that have been made throughout this pandemic have led us to the situation where Arizona is second only to Mississippi in COVID deaths per capita over the first 2 years of the pandemic. So CDC now has 2 years worth of data up on their website. And we did some math to calculate deaths per capita over that entire time period. And only Mississippi is doing more poorly than Arizona. And if you do the trend line on it, Mississippi is the death trend line for Mississippi is not nearly as steep as Arizona's. And our forecast is that Arizona's will have the dubious distinction of being the most lethal state by mid-February. Of course, the governor says that it's winter visitors and bad luck, but that's not the case, as we'll talk about. I want to show, the reason I pulled this up is I want to go to a couple of graphs so you can see kind of what the Epi Curve actually looks like. Isn't this pretty striking? So what this is the COVID cases in Arizona over the course of the last year. And what you see here is what we had become known as the Delta wave. And it was really a double wave for that Delta wave. But this is the the representation of the cases per 100,000. And then you can see like right around here was when that Omicron variant was discovered in the southern part of Africa. And you can see what that did to the case count. This is attributable to two main things. Number one is the fact that this Omicron variant is far more contagious than the Delta version of this virus. And it is very adept at finding especially unvaccinated persons, but also people who have been fully vaccinated. It's able to give them a milder case of the infection, which seldom leads to bad outcomes. But basically what you can see is happening right now is this incredibly steep run up in cases. This is case rates right here over the last, really since Thanksgiving, but the big increase was started in the second half of December. One of the things, if you look at the graph, you have to be kind of look at it carefully, is you can start to see that the exponential part of this is beginning to level off just a little bit. If you look at what has been happening in the UK and on the Eastern Seaboard, what you start to see is that when you see a pattern like this, it tends to drop off fairly quickly. Now, that may not happen here because our vaccination rates are much worse. Well, I say much worse, worse than in the UK and in those Eastern Seaboard states. But I think it's reasonable to expect that at some point in March, we'll start to see case counts that are, down in this range, 500 per 100,000, type, and maybe even something comparable to what we saw over the early part of the summer. So, and basically what I see happening here, this is the hospital. I want to talk about this for a second too. What I see happening is that this Omicron version of the virus is rapidly finding all those persons who are unwilling to get vaccinated, and it's immunizing them with the virus itself. And what we have seen in the data with publications recently is that a natural infection with the Omicron variant does provide robust immunity, both T cell and antibody immunity. And so all those persons that have been unwilling to get vaccinated this virus is finding them. And we're rapidly approaching the point where everyone who hasn't been vaccinated is going to be infected at some point with this. And that's what's going to bring us down to sort of baseline levels in what we call endemic in epidemiology, which means it's no longer a pandemic, but it's a sporadic illness that will be with us forever, but it will no longer present a public health emergency because persons will have generated an antibody response, both T cell, especially T cell, but also antibody response. And so an infection becomes increasingly mild. And what I'm describing now is also what we will most likely see in the developing world, and I think we may have touched upon this in my previous presentation about the ethics of the international vaccine campaign, where rich countries like the UK, Western Europe, the United States soaked up the supply of vaccine and was unwilling to release for open source the research of the vaccine companies so that the vaccine could be developed and reasonably and deployed into the developing world. That never really happened at scale like it could have. COVAX has delivered over 1 billion doses so far, but that I think is a real shortcoming of the international response. But the reason I'm mentioning that is because I expect this Omicron variant is also traveling very quickly through the developing world. And that is also a factor in how I believe that we're in a transition point for this becoming endemic rather than being a pandemic. In the early part of December, I got to be honest with you, I was pretty much freaking out because we knew at that point from the information and data from South Africa, which has good research institutions, by the way, and a good public health department with good surveillance, we knew that this Omicron variant was far more transmissible and communicable than the Delta version. But at that point in early December, we didn't have enough knowledge about its clinical presentation to figure out like what the impact was going to be. So we knew that Omicron was going to infect a lot more people a lot more quickly, but we didn't know enough about the clinical presentation. Right around, I'd say about December 19th or 20th, some research began to come out of South Africa, the UK, also the US, and most recently last week, which you can see on my blog, from Southern California, clear information showing that the Omicron variant is significantly less lethal when compared head-to-head with Delta. And that right there is what saved the world from an apocalypse, quite honestly, because if Omicron had been as deadly as Delta, there is absolutely no way our any medical system could be able to handle the magnitude and scale of care that would have been required, not just for COVID patients, but for everyone else who needed care. Fortunately, Omicron is about 20 to 30% as lethal as Delta, and that gave enough of a margin of safety in the healthcare system so that we wouldn't be swamped with just an unbearable burden of needed care. And I just want to highlight this graph real quickly that reflects what I just said. So this is from yesterday. This is the map of general ward capacity. So not ICU, but just regular hospital bed usage of COVID patients like right now. And you can see this was our wave in 2020. This is the wave from the winter of 2020, at the end of 2020 and the beginning of this year. These are the two Delta waves. And what you can see here is Omicron is sending more people to the hospitals and they're ending up in general ward beds, but it's not translating into increases in ICU bed use. And that reflects what we now know about the clinical presentation of Omicron, which is that it generally infects from the nasopharynx up. It's more of an upper respiratory infection versus Delta and Alpha before it, and the ancestral strains, which had a clinical presentation deeper in the lungs. And so when persons either have a breakthrough case, well, especially if they have a breakthrough case, but if previously uninfected and unvaccinated people get an infection with this Omicron variant, it tends to be presenting as a really bad sore throat, issues with the sinuses. They might have a cough, but they're unlikely, although it does happen, but they're far less likely to get a deep lung pneumonia infection when compared to Delta. And that difference in clinical presentation is what, like I said, just saved us from what would have just been apocalyptic. And it's just luck. Although there is, I will say, there is evolutionary pressure for viruses to become both more transmissible, because the goal of the virus is just to make more copies of itself. Reproduction is its goal. So if it can make more copies of itself more quickly, there's evolutionary pressure towards that. And so viruses tend to get more contagious as they evolve, especially coronaviruses. But at the same time, there's evolutionary pressure to not be as lethal, because if you kill your host, you're not going to be able to reproduce as much virus. So, so there's this general drift towards something that's more contagious and less lethal, but it doesn't always happen that way. We were just fortunate that that is what ended up happening with Omicron. A lot of folks have asked me what I think in terms of, like, are we facing another variant? My attitude is that it's hard for me to believe. Well, first of all, of course, this virus is going to continue to mutate. It's going to create new variants. That's the nature of, that's how the reproduction of the RNA works on this. And some of those strains are going to drop by the wayside. But in order for a new strain to be able to take over from Omicron, it's going to have to be one of two things. Number one, it would have to be even more contagious than Omicron. Hard for me to see that actually happening. Because if you could have a more lethal strain, but if it's less contagious than Omicron, it's not going to be able to outcompete Omicron. So I don't see that being something that ends up creating a new variant that's troublesome. What's a non-zero threat, I think, is for the virus to evolve in a way that escapes previously built, especially T-cell immunity. We've already seen Omicron be able to escape some antibody immunity, which is why the boosters are so important to get. But what we have not seen yet is that is the virus mutating in a way that escapes T-cell immunity. And here's the way I like to describe the difference between the two. Antibodies are like the EMTs and paramedics that show up when you dial 911. Like, they're jotting on the spot. They're there right away. They try to neutralize the virus immediately, and they're circulating in your serum and your blood. And that's their job, is to attack right away. But the real workhorse of your immune system are your T cells. And but they're slower acting, but they're more sophisticated. So you can think of T cells as more of like, your surgeons and your doctors and the folks in the hospital that provide that higher level of response. It's not as fast, but it is what ultimately helps you clear the infection is your T cells. And I've seen no evidence to suggest that any of these variants that have evolved over time are escaping T cell immunity. So that's why I don't believe that we're going to see a new variant that's able to escape T cell immunity, which is what I think it would take at this point for us to create a new variant that would end up extending this pandemic and preventing us from moving to what is going to end up being an endemic virus. So with all that being said, I think the bottom line is, I think it would be probably safe for you to start thinking that that the benefits of opening the community center would outweigh the risks probably by the end of March or early April. I have to believe that this is a highly vaccinated community, most of whom have gotten booster shots. Everyone is okay with mitigation measures. And so I think it is a good time for your board to start thinking through the processes for reopening the community center, because the benefits, we're rapidly approaching the place where I think the benefits would outweigh any kind of risk for opening that. So that's like the big picture thing I wanted to cover first. Now I think I'll start with my main presentation, and then we'll get to some Q&A. Now I'm going to cover 2 years worth of stuff really fast. So I'm going to have to move quickly through some of these major policy things, but I've given a lot of talks like this in different groups. And quite honestly, the Q&A part is always, I think, the most interesting, just by looking at body language and how people respond. So I'm going to go quickly through these big policy high points, and then we can get to some of the Q&A stuff that's probably populated in the chat box already. So I'll start with a little story about how this all started and how I started being so ubiquitous, I guess you would say, in responding to journalists about this pandemic over the course of the last 2 years. And it's, I was the former director for the state health department. I was served as that ADHS director during the Brewer administration. And when Ducey came in, everyone was able, if they wanted to, they could apply for their old job and be able to kept on, and which I did do. I applied for my old position, and Governor Ducey asked me to stay. And so I said I would, but I quickly found out that, his management style and mine were not in the same place. It wasn't politics, because Brewer was, I'm a Dem, and Brewer was a pretty conservative person, but I could get along with her management style. She was a delegator. Basically, she left us alone, which I liked. And I could tell that this was going to be very different with the Ducey people, with them wanting to approve decisions and priorities and stuff. So I decided to leave. And then when those first cases right around 2 years ago, first started to pop up in the U.S., and I don't think we got an Arizona case until probably early March, if I remember right, of 2020. I kind of had been getting calls from journalists asking to do, television and radio interviews and so forth. And throughout the early part of March, I was saying no. I would talk on background, but I was like declining to do television and radio and even print. I was mostly talking on background, which is to help the journalists tell the story, but I didn't want to be like the front person for it, because I thought, well, I left the job. Kara, who was one of my deputies, was selected as the director. This Dr. Chris, you would probably see her on TV and stuff. And so I thought, well, out of respect for them, I left. I'm gonna let them talk and be the persons who were sort of describing the situation. And in March, I think it was the beginning part of March, the U of A and all the universities were still in session. And I was giving a guest lecture down in Tucson at the College of Public Health. And after the lecture, the assistant dean came to me and said, hey, we're going through accreditation. And so we have this big buffet. So we got some tacos and stuff upstairs. Why don't you come and, we'll eat off of the food, what do you call those things? The buffet tables and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, sure. So Doug, his name was Doug Tarrin. And I go back to his office and, we're just kind of shooting the breeze. And the subject of what at that time, we were still calling it the coronavirus. It's before it even had the name COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, I think. And so he just nonchalantly mentioned to me that the College of Public Health down in Tucson had been getting calls from journalists around the state, both in Phoenix and Tucson and everywhere, asking for some perspective about epidemiology, virology, about what pandemics are, what this could mean in Arizona, what we know about the virus. And they were told by the governor's office that they were to decline all interviews and they couldn't talk to the media. I mean, these are like epidemiologists and virologists, some of the most talented academics in the entire state working at the College of Public Health down in Tucson. And they got a call from the top floor of the governor's office saying, don't let your faculty talk to journalists. I mean, and Doug was just being kind of nonchalant about it. But I'm like, are you kidding me? They're the most talented people in the entire state on a topic that's going to be really important for the next, we don't know how long, and they can't talk. And I remember driving home from Tucson up here, and that's the moment where I decided, okay, you know what? I'm answering every media call that I get. I'm going to go on the record. I'm going to do every interview where I know the subject matter. And if I don't know the subject matter, I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to find out about it. And I am going to say yes to everything from now on, because if the governor thinks that every single message in this state is going to be filtered through Kara Christ, he is badly mistaken. And that's what happened. And because the dean was told all media requests are to be turned back to, his name is Chris Minnick. He was the FLAC, we call him, and the communications guy at ADHS. And Kara Christ is the only one that's going to be talking. And increasingly what I began to see is that, and journalists also began to see, is that they weren't telling the whole truth. They were spinning things, and they were framing the public discussion in a way that was not honest. It wasn't, and it still isn't. To be honest, it still isn't. And so at the beginning, I was kind of the one. that was speaking the most. And I'll tell you also why that ended up happening too, is because I'm going to be perfectly honest with all y'all. This administration plays hardball. Like, they play hardball. And if you say things that they don't appreciate or like, there can be consequences. And so one of the reasons you don't see hospital CEOs speaking out as much as they could be is because they have an understanding that irritating the governor or the governor's people on the 8th and 9th floor could end up translating into, say, for example, a Medicaid rate decrease, which could be hundreds of millions of dollars in fines for a hospital system. And so there's all these organizations out there that would like to have been more forthcoming during this whole pandemic, but because there is a risk to the organization for speaking out, that had a chilling effect on how transparent they were willing to be when asked about this. And so I think those two factors are how I ended up sort of being the voice of, like, this is what I believe to be the truth. And there's a lot of people, you can see them on Twitter, that hate my guts and think that I'm an idiot. But what I've tried to do all along is to try to stick with the honesty, with facts, back up what I say with evidence, and then point to evidence-based interventions that I believe would have been very helpful at saving lives, with a lens to what the costs of those are too, because some of these interventions you have to look at the risks and benefits, just like opening the community center, like, what's the benefit versus what's the risk. And so all these interventions that I'm going to touch on here in a few minutes have a cost to them. And so you have to be thoughtful about what you think is a good intervention. And some of the things that are no-brainers are things like universal masking. I mean, we've known since, I think, June 11th of 2020 that when everyone in the room is wearing a mask, it keeps the virus out of the air and cuts transmission dramatically in indoor environments. And what's the cost of a mask? It's basically nothing, which is way different from closing bars, restaurants, and nightclubs. So that has a cost, right? The employees, the staff, the business itself. So that has a real cost. But universal masking is an area where, like, you're asking for a simple behavior that costs next to nothing. And yet the governor has been completely hostile to that for many months now. So let me take probably the next 20 minutes until like the 11 o'clock hour. And then I hope at 11 to transition over to Q&A. So let me paint like a broad brush picture of some of the policy decisions. So I have to say, at the very beginning, when the governor first did the original stay-at-home order, I was actually supportive of the decisions that he made on that order. There were many journalists that were criticizing that it was too open-ended, like that it was like the other states weren't allowing for, say, recreational stuff like like golf and this kind of stuff. And my attitude was, look, on that original stay-at-home order, you got to be thoughtful about what you're going to restrict, because people do need to get physical activity. They do need to get exercise. They do need to do things. And so I was supportive of the exemptions that the governor built into that original stay-at-home order, because I thought they were pretty thoughtful. And I was honest about all that, and was actually at that point in April, probably if you look at my interviews in April of 2020, I was complimentary of the department and of the governor's decision-making. And if you look at those original executive orders, there were a lot of executive orders at the very beginning that were like, how can we mitigate some of these things, both economically, but also through the virus. Now, there were parts of it that were bad that he did at that beginning. Like, for example, from the very beginning, through executive order, not only did he not do a statewide face covering mandate in the summer of 2020, once we knew that universal masking was such an effective tool He actually was preventing cities and counties from having masking mandates in place. And these are like charter cities and county governments that have constitutional authority to make decisions like this. But he had an executive order using emergency powers to prevent them from having universal masking. So there were some bad mistakes that he made in that early portion, but there was also some good stuff that he did back then. And I think if you look at where a major turning point in terms of policy was during this pandemic, I believe I always point to like May 2nd of 2020. And that's the moment where Governor Ducey extended that original stay-at-home order for another 2 weeks to go into May 15th. And at that point, he was going to contemplate transitioning to less of a stay-at-home order, but having some measures in place, like requirements on mitigation for businesses, for example. And he did do that executive order. And then former President Trump announced that he was going to come to Arizona and visit the Honeywell factory, who had converted to making N95 masks. And as soon as former President Trump announced that visit, the next day, Governor Ducey changed the executive order he had promulgated only 3 days earlier and moved us completely out of the stay-at-home order on May 15th of 2020. And honestly, I didn't have a problem with ending the stay-at-home order on May 15th. What I objected to was that the way we ended that stay-at-home order was we went from an effective stay-at-home order to a free-for-all, because there was no required mitigation in bars, restaurants, and nightclubs. And by then, we had seen through many publications that the crowded indoor environments with alcohol are the ones that most effectively amplify this virus. And so the fact that we moved out on May 15th to a completely honest honor system environment for mitigation is what led us to that inertial wave where we were the worst in the world, which was all throughout the very end of June and into July. And that was because May 15th, the stay-at-home order ended completely, and there was no enforcement of any kind of mitigation whatsoever. And you saw in like downtown Scottsdale, they were having free champagne and rappers and stuff coming in, and they were packed all the way to completely packed. And within 2 weeks, we were in absolute exponential growth in the beginning of June. And that's when I started doing a whole lot of advocacy, not just locally, but on MSNBC and some other CNN and stuff about and I kept saying, it's not about too early. It's about how you ended the stay-at-home order with no enforcement of any kind of mitigation measure in those crowded indoor environments with alcohol. And that doesn't mean that we had to keep bars closed. It meant that you had to have capacity limits, that you had to have requirements for ventilation, that you had to have spacing, and that you had to require masking where appropriate and where you could do it. But none of that stuff happened. And that's why we ended up with such exponential growth, and why at the beginning of July, we ended up in the crisis standards of care, where they were actually rationing healthcare to people because there just was insufficient resources, much like today, by the way. They just haven't declared crisis standards of care, but we are in at least contingency, if not crisis standards of care right now, and probably will be for at least a couple of weeks. But I will say there was a moment, and I can remember it at the late June press conference when we were going exponential, and it was obvious that the hospital system was going to be in big trouble shortly. I can remember Governor Ducey and Director Christ having that press conference, which they used to carry live on television all the time, and I could see that he was scared. That's the only time during this whole thing where I saw that he actually gave body language suggesting that he knew that he had made a big mistake and that he actually cared that he made a bad mistake. Because that part of him, I think, is gone. the caring about mistakes, in my opinion. I don't see any evidence of that anymore. But at that point he did, and that's when they did the pause of the bars, restaurants, and nightclubs. And restaurants were still open for takeout during that July period, but the bars and nightclubs were closed unless they had food. And so they let like bars have grilled cheese sandwiches and called that food, and that's another matter. But there's a good publication. It worked. That intervention worked dramatically. It cut cases by 85% within 4 weeks. And so that wave I showed you earlier on the screen share from June, that the way that wave ended was because of the suspension of the bars, restaurants, and nightclubs. So that was actually an intervention that was effective that they did. And but then they made the same mistake that they made in mid-May. What? They allowed the bars, restaurants, and nightclubs to open, which was a good thing. Before they were allowed to open, they were required to sign an attestation with the state health department that they would follow these CDC mitigation measures on distancing, ventilation, and masking, and so forth. And so they all, in order to open after that summer pause, they had to sign these attestations, which was a good thing. I thought, okay, Kara's making a good decision here. They're putting them on a hook for signing an attestation that they could actually enforce. And so I was doing a bunch of advocacy saying, you know, look, we got to have a complaint hotline and this kind of stuff if it's going to work and if there's going to be enforcement. But it was obvious right away that the attestations were just window dressing, and they were not doing any enforcement of those mitigation measures, with one exception. And it happened about 15 times, and Joe Dana on Channel 12 did a story that I helped him about this, which was like, if a journalist would go out to a bar and take a video, you know, of the pandemonium, and then tweet that out, then and it went viral, then the next day or 2 days after that, they would get a visit from the state health department and would get admonished and probably suspend their liquor license for like 48 hours so they could say they did something. But by and large, there was no enforcement of those attestations. And that is what led to the behavior in the bars, restaurants, and nightclubs of both the operators and the people who go to those places. And was precisely why we ended up with such a lethal winter last year in December and January. And remember, that was before the vaccine. So what I kept saying is that, look, when young people go to bars, restaurants, and nightclubs, yes, it's true that they are at much lower risk for having a bad outcome from an infection, but they're starting chains of transmission that end up infecting people like my parents, you know? And so, like, the reason it's important to clamp down on bars, restaurants, and nightclubs is to stop the chains of transmission that end up killing persons in nursing homes and other older people at higher risk and people with chronic medical conditions. And so, but either they never made the connection, which I don't think that's true. They just didn't care. And so you kept hearing former Director Chris and Governor Ducey some, although you haven't heard him talk about the pandemic at all probably in the last year. But like, they just said, the reason that this is going to be bad is from family gatherings, you know, and family gatherings. I mean, you get people together for a cookie party around Christmas. That is an environment that causes chains of transmission to start. But we already knew from the summer of 2020 that the dominant thing were bars, the places, crowded indoor places with alcohol. And yet they were completely unwilling to do that. And then I can remember one of the final press conferences when the governor was actually talking about COVID. This is in December of 20. He kept saying, you know, there's no safety net. If we were to shut the bars, restaurants, and nightclubs, there's no safety net anymore. and therefore I can't do that. Safety net meaning like PPP programs and things like that. But at the same very time, he took $500 million in COVID relief, the CARES Act money, and backfilled the state agency general fund budgets with that $500 million. So instead of using the $500 million to provide a safety net for bars, restaurants, and nightclubs in the winter of 2020, he's backfilled state agency budgets and then got on the news and said, oh, well, there's no safety net available, when he just squandered $500 million backfilling state agency budgets. So, and that's, if someone asked me where I think the most lethal mistake was made during this whole pandemic, it was not doing anything about the bars and nightclubs in December of 2020 and January of 2021 and the first part of February of 2021, when the change, that was what was creating these chains of transmission that were infecting high-risk people. And this was what, remember, the only people that could get a vaccine at that point were over 70 years old and teachers and cops and stuff, and healthcare workers. So it took a long time to get other people vaccinated. And by the way, there's another thing about the whole vaccination rollout, which I won't get into much, which is that there was an equity problem with the vaccine rollout, in the sense that the appointment system that you had to have an appointment to get your vaccine, and the system that they set up greatly favored wealthy people who have good broadband and Wi-Fi and were computer literate and knew how to operate the computer and knew the difference between Chrome and Edge, because you couldn't make an appointment using Edge. You had to use Chrome. Like, there was a huge equity problem in terms of the vaccine rollout in the beginning, because the way the appointment system was set up, it greatly favored wealthy persons. And there were ways that they could have, other states had a more of a random selection where you registered at any time. Remember, the way it worked with us was the website would open up for appointments and they would fill up in 39 minutes. Like, they'd have 20,000 appointments that filled up in 39 minutes. Like what they did in Minnesota was you could go online and register anytime, and then they would have a random selection in the back end of the system and send you to a pharmacy for that vaccine, instead of having like these big mega sites at the stadium and all. So there were ways to more ethically roll out that vaccine that took into account health equity for lower income persons and people with language challenges and so forth, and people with disabilities, because well, I don't have time to go into that. But people with disabilities were supposed to be in category 1B, and then they made it into a free-for-all where people with disabilities had to compete with everybody else, which I thought was wrong. Anyway, I'm running out of time here, but so now we're into the first part of 2020, and some of the bigger policy decisions at that point had to do with non-pharmaceutical interventions that could have made a difference. So let's take the early spring of 2021. Schools, K-12, up until about, I took a note. March, schools were required to have universal masking within the classroom environment. And in March, the governor did an executive order that removed that statewide requirement and put that decision to the local school boards, which meant that they had to fight the parents. Instead of the governor taking the hit, it made all of the governing board members be responsible for putting in that mask mandate. And that's when we saw a lot of schools dropping the universal masking requirements. But then he wasn't satisfied. During the budget, if you remember, negotiations in that legislative session in June of 2021, he actually signed the bill that that actually prohibited schools from requiring masks in the classroom. And for the life of me, that is something that I will never understand, why you would actually prohibit something that is saving lives that has basically no cost. Like there was no, like the masks are by then in great supply. And by the way, if everyone's wearing a mask, you don't need an N95 because the masks are great at stopping particles from leaving. The regular masks are not great at filtering back this way. The N95s you need for that. But if everyone's wearing a mask, like in a classroom, there's a lot less transmission. And the Maricopa County Public Health did a study that showed that the schools that had universal masking had 3.5 times fewer outbreaks of COVID-19 than the schools that didn't have the masking requirement. That was published in a CDC MMWR. Thankfully, the Arizona Supreme Court just a few months ago ruled that the process that the legislature used to prevent schools from requiring masks was unconstitutional. Not the prohibition itself, but the way they did it was unconstitutional. And so that had been removed. And now we do see some schools that are doing the universal masking. Another big mistake, I think, that the governor and both Director Christ and now Director Harrington missed out on was using policy tools to incentivize vaccination. I mean, they've been relying solely on stuff like PSAs, which, by the way, don't look focus test group tested at all to me. You know, having Director Christ in a parking lot with a syringe talking for 30 seconds, that's not a compelling PSA. The new ones with Ducey and Carmona standing next to a flag, there's no way a focus group said oh, now I'm going to go get my shots. I mean, the Ad Council has some that like appeal to many of the 10 principles of humanism, by the way. An effective ad appeals to emotion, not like thinking. And so there are good ads that are out there, but the ads they're running are kind of a joke. But what I mean by policy interventions that they could have used, which is, and it's powerful and it works to raise vaccination rates. If you tell people, I call it the fear of missing out. If you tell people, look, if you want to go to a bar, restaurant, nightclub, museum, theater, a public space that's indoors, you're going to need to show your vaccination card. And that's how you get people who don't want to get vaccinated to get vaccinated. They're going to be pissed, a lot of them. Some won't be pissed. Some will be like, okay, I'll go get the J&J now. I'm not pissed about it. But now, since I can't go to the bar, I'm going to go get a shot now. And there's other people that would have been really pissed about that. But it's an effective tool. And we would have much higher vaccination rates today if Governor Ducey and former Director Christ and current Director Harrington would have used their statutory authority, which they have in Arizona Revised Statutes 36,787, to make that as a policy, which would drive people's behavior so that we'd have higher vaccination levels. But as it is, we are fortunate that Omicron, like I said at the top, is far less lethal than Delta. The virus is doing the heavy work right now of vaccinating people with infection. That's what's happening. They're building antibodies and T cells as we speak, and that those infections that have been happening and will continue to happen, excuse me, for the next few weeks, those infections are what are going to build the immunity that we're going to need to get close to herd immunity. And as I said, I don't think this will ever go away completely, but it will get to the point where it's sporadic enough and there's enough of T cell memory in everybody's immune system so that it's no longer a threat, to the hospital system and so forth. So let's see. Are we good to go to the chat room now, Ron?
Yeah, we are. There's been a slew of questions that have come in. Yes, so if you're ready, we can certainly do that.
Okay.
If you would like to raise your hand to ask a question, I will go ahead and get started with some of the things that happened at the beginning regarding the vaccination stuff. So James asked, will we need another booster shot or maybe wait for a new vaccine?
I think, I don't know the answer to that question. What I will say is what the immune response that you built through your vaccines or a previous infection is providing really good T cell immunity. That grunt work part of your immune system is there. And there is no evidence that any of these variants have evaded that T cell immunity. Where we've seen the erosion is with the antibody, the specificity of the antibodies to the protein coat. And so that's where I think there will probably be boosters available in the future that are more tailored to the newer versions of the virus that are more specifically focused on the new protein coat that Omicron has or subsequent versions. So I expect there to be like an annual booster shot that I don't think it'll be with your influenza vaccine, because those one's an mRNA vaccine and the other is a attenuated adenovirus vaccine. So I don't see them coming together, but it would be the kind of thing where you probably, when many people, when they get their influenza vaccine in the fall, will get a more tailored and specific mRNA vaccine. And that's the beauty of these mRNA vaccines, is that they are much easier to tweak than the adenovirus type vectors like the Johnson & Johnson vaccine.
Okay. Alice and Kara, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Ron. I have a question in the chat that mentions Will's statement at the beginning, pretty much of your presentation. Well, with full vaccinations, the benefits will outweigh the risks in having in-person events, end quote. In your estimation, when is the will? Many people are acting as if right now is the back to normal time. Over.
No, I would say as we get back to on this, when you see baseline rates like this, cases at 100 cases per 100,000 per week, that range, and we're going to get here. This graph is going to go down. I don't know how steep it's going to go down, but we're going to get to a place where the infection rates are in the 100. So basically, these are like when you start seeing reports of 500 to 1,000 to 1,500 cases a day, as opposed to today where we had 23,000. So that's that caveat. Now, the thing is that opening the community center with mitigation is what makes the most sense. And especially if you've got persons with medical conditions that put them at higher risk, even if they're fully vaccinated. So, and people who are immunocompromised. So you have to think through the mitigation that you'll be asking people to do when you do open the community center. But I would look at the case rates per 100,000 and look at the Epi Curve and be prepared, because I think it is going to happen this spring where we see enough of a drop off that we're never going to get to zero. It's not, I don't think we'll ever get to the point where this is not circulating. I think it always will. It's a question of getting to the point where the risks are manageable. And if you're mitigating, you're going to be unlikely to have virus in the room to begin with.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have some regarding the two similar ones from Joel and Sarah regarding immunocompromised, immunosuppressed people, regarding plans and guidance going forward. Do you care to comment on that?
Only to say that of all the persons during this pandemic, the people that got the shortest end of the stick are the people who were immunocompromised. I mean, because it like, let's say you're going under chemotherapy, or you have, you're getting a treatment that's compromising your immune system. you can't, like if you get vaccinated, you're not going to mount the immune response that's going to protect you. So we had and still have a community responsibility to protect people that are immunocompromised, but sadly, the leadership of the state has been ignoring that group. And sadly, there are not enough people that care about other people to have the right behavior without the right policies in place. And so that's why the policies are so important, because you wouldn't need policies if everyone was acting with the 10 principles of humanism, you wouldn't need the policies. But because people don't think that way, or not enough of them, then you have to have policies to drive and compel the kind of behavior that you need to protect immunocompromised people. And so what has happened is people that are immunocompromised have ended up being in a kind of stay-at-home order this whole time, or deciding that they're going to have to risk their lives by, going out because they can get vaccinated and they're not going to have the immune response to protect them. So that's why the community mitigation is so important. So I don't have any simple answers for it, except I do feel badly for them this whole time that no one's had their back.
And so there is no long-term strategy for that?
Not in this state.
Okay. All right. Next up, we have a thing from YouTube, and then Roy, I'll be coming to you. So Austin Butts asks, it sounds like any fault in public health policy in the pandemic is because of poor risk management and cost benefit analysis. How can this be fixed before the next pandemic?
Well, that's a good question. And I'm going to take a little sidetrack on this, because back in the early 2000s, like 2003, when Governor Napolitano was in office, I was a younger man in state government, and we looked at the public health preparedness statutes that were on the books, and they were really, the public health emergency laws on the books were very, very rudimentary. And that's when we overhauled, Roxanne, you remember, we overhauled the law and built ARS 36787, which is the public health emergency authority that the state health director has and that the governor also has in Title 13. But nowhere in our public discussions did we contemplate a governor misusing that authority to harm the response. That's not something that came up. Like, we wrote all this broad authority into the statute that gave governors and health directors all this authority, and we never thought that they would misuse it to harm the response. But that's precisely not completely what happened, because there were times when they used that authority for good reasons and helpful things. But often they misuse that authority, like prohibiting masks. And I have a whole, it's on my website, there's a report on this. But so the question becomes, was 787 written too broadly to give too much authority, or did we just end up with a governor and a health director that were unwilling to use that authority for good, helpful reasons? And ultimately, the answer to your question is political. It's the persons that you hire for these jobs, especially the governor, is really, really important, and especially during a public health emergency. And it's so important to have a person in that job that actually thinks that cares, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And we didn't, in my opinion, we missed out on that for much of this pandemic. Not at the beginning. I think he did a good job at the beginning. So it really comes down to hiring the right people for these jobs. But I don't think we need to change 36787, the law. I think we have to hope that next time there's a different personality, or hopefully there's not a next time like this. But I will say that there is a bill at the state legislature right now that would eliminate, that would stop a public health emergency declaration and make the governor go back to the legislature every 60 days, I think, to renew it. So we'll see what happens with that bill.
Okay. Okay. Roy, you are up next, sir. You're muted.
Your control. I'm sorry.
There you go.
Okay. Anyway, I wonder what are the or who are the institutions or organizations that are putting the pressure on to that are able to force whoever's in charge, like the governor, from implementing these measures to prevent the spread of the virus, and you know, what are their what's their reasoning for it? Do you know?
Well, sadly, there hasn't been enough or sufficient pressure to change. I mean, here's the thing: during a public health emergency, governors have enormous authority, you know, and we just have been, for the most, I don't want to say the whole time, but for much of this pandemic, we've had a governor and health director who've been unwilling to use that authority. And, you know, because I've been using whatever influence I can have with public opinion and talking to journalists and so forth. That's been my approach, because I'm not welcome in the building over there. It's not like they're going to come and ask me what my opinion is. But I know that there are stakeholder meetings, what this administration calls them trusted partners. So, you know, people from the hospital systems and the Arizona Medical Association and others who don't publicly criticize the governor's decisions. I know there are conversations that happen up in the 8th and 9th floor conference rooms. I'm never invited to any of those. But ultimately, in my opinion, the decisions are framed through the lens of what he believes his political future is. This is my opinion. And that his decisions for the last year and a half have been seen through the lens of what he sees as happening next for him politically, and what he and what. That's my opinion. That's just an opinion. That's totally editorial.
So in other words, you don't really know.
No.
Okay.
So,
That's unfortunate.
yeah. So along that line, someone asked, what is Biden's role in this, and what would you recommend he should be doing, both legislatively and from the CDC? Well,
it's a great question. So both with the previous administration and this administration, I believe that both presidents have been overly criticized for making mistakes. The reason I say that is because the boots on the ground actual authority lies with governors. Governors are the ones that have the statutory authority to implement those non-pharmaceutical interventions that are so effective. And that's why you see such a range. Look, I mean, I'm going to go back and do a screen share real quick. This is just a graph from today's blog. All 50 states are on this graph. This is the deaths per 100,000. And you can see that Arizona is second only to Mississippi. And you could go down this graph, and there are many states that had a great response with far less lethal consequences. And it was in the same country, with the same CDC, with the same presidents, whether it was Trump or Biden. And the difference was they had governors and health directors that used evidence to drive their decision-making. And that's why you see places like Vermont, who performed tremendously well, and places like Mississippi and Arizona that have been a train wreck. And so the governors are the governors are the places where the real decision making on those non-pharmaceutical interventions like masking or bars, restaurants, and nightclubs around policies for vaccination had such an impact. But going to your question, if I could go back in time and convince President Biden to do one thing, it would be to require, go back to say late fall and require a vaccination card for domestic air travel. Because that would have forced a lot of people to get vaccinated who'd been unwilling to get vaccinated. It's easy and simple to implement. TSA can they're already checking your ID. They could check your vaccination card and it's not going to slow the lines down. And it would have been a very effective, high return on investment tool that the president has authority over. Because that's the thing. If you're going to ask a president to do something, they need the authority to actually do it. Because air travel is an interstate thing, he has authority. That he could have done that, and he didn't do that. And if he had done that, yes, there would have been lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of pissed off people. You know who they are. They're not wearing masks. They're the ones that won't wear their mask on the jet in the first place. And they would have been forced to get vaccinated to get on that jet, and they'd be pissed. But it would have been a powerful motivating tool to get people vaccinated that the president had authority over.
Yep. Excellent. Love that. So Athena, you are up next, or Paul.
Yes. Early on in this thing, the emphasis was always on, oh my God, we've got to, isolate. We've got to stop the spread, and we got to wait for a vaccine. And there was almost no effort on mitigation or treatment. Nobody was saying, wow, we know that vitamin D is really important in the immune system. So you guys start doing the vitamin D. You got to start losing weight. Okay. There's already some drugs on the market that have had a good track record, like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. And there were doctors early on who were saying, yes, I've been treating hundreds of people with these things, and I've been able to save lots of people from going into ventilators. And when those people, got into the public eye, they were shouted down, oh, you're quacks. No, there's no treatment. There's no treatment. You can't treat this. You have to wait for the vaccine. And it's like, what did you think of the reaction to that? Because now it's come out that, oh, by the way, 90% of the people who died were vitamin D deficient. Oh, by the way, these other drugs that, that are pretty safe. Yeah, we probably could have used those. So my question is, what's your thought on the early reaction to all these things in your estimation?
No, there's a couple things I agree with you on, and some others I don't. One thing I agree with is that there could have been more emphasis on the things that you can do personally to put yourself at lower risk for a bad outcome way before the vaccine. So for example, one of the things that we've known for a long time is having a really high BMI, body mass index, and especially if it's so high that you've got type 2 diabetes, that puts you at particularly high risk for a bad outcome. And there was not, I don't think, hardly any emphasis, at least at the national level, and I know certainly not at the state level here in Arizona, on the things that you can do lifestyle wise. Smoking as another example, which puts you at higher risk for the pneumonia outcomes with this virus. The other, let's see, you had another point that I forgot around, treatments. So on the treatment end of things, at the very beginning, I actually had a blog about hydroxychloroquine saying, let's explore this. And my attitude is that I believe in the system of using clinical trials to establish the safety and effectiveness of the various different therapies. And I supported and was crossing my fingers that hydroxychloroquine would have been something that would have been shown to be safe and effective. And there were a lot of people that participated in clinical trials, especially in New York, with hydroxychloroquine. But the results were that the folks that took hydroxychloroquine in the clinical trials, and you compare the people that took it and that didn't, it actually had a detrimental effect and was not effective. So, there are people I know that say that hydroxychloroquine is an effective therapeutic. I can just say that I've never seen a clinical trial that supports that. And the same thing with ivermectin. So ultimately, it's a question of, do you trust the process or don't you trust the process of using clinical trials to establish what's a safe and effective therapy? And I do think it's important for people to be able to voluntarily participate in those clinical trials so we can answer those questions. But once you have enough of a sample size, and once you have enough results to give you clear evidence of whether it's effective or not, then you ought to use that information to help guide your clinical decision making. Speaking of therapeutics, there are a couple, both Merck and Pfizer have antiviral therapeutics that are actually quite effective. The problem is that they, the mechanism that they use to thwart the reproduction of the virus within the body pose risks, to example, for pregnant women and so forth. So, it needs to be used judiciously. But with respect to therapeutics, I myself trust the process. I believe in clinical trials, and I think the results of those trials should drive clinical practice.
Excellent, excellent. Couple more. Roxanne asks, can you talk about the national and Arizona's influenza plan?
I have to say, I haven't paid enough attention to influenza recently. I will say it is circulating in Arizona. There is a component that's happening right now of, and it's creating an influx into the hospitals as well, just like it always does. But I will say one thing, which you didn't ask this in your question, but one of the things we learned last winter is that even with sporadic masking, not even universal masking, but even if some people are sporadically masking, it has a profound impact on influenza circulation. And one of the things we found out is that masks are more effective with influenza than they are COVID-19, because we didn't have influenza last year. And that not just here, but also in the Southern Hemisphere, when they had their winter, they had practically no influenza circulating as well. So now we have a new tool, if people will use it, besides immunization, to help with influenza. But Roxanne, I don't have anything more to say on that.
So are there specific pandemic plans that are now in place to help us be better than how we responded last time?
This is what Roxanne and I worked on years ago. Arizona influenza pandemic response plan. And if so I think that, here's the thing about planning is it's only effective if you actually use the plan, which I didn't see any evidence that they used at this time. A lot of the stuff in that influenza pandemic response plan would have applied to what we experienced the last couple of years.
So Alice and Kara ask, is there a country showing how have countries done regarding the COVID stuff? And what country would you prefer to live in? And if you were to prefer to live in a state based on their COVID response, what state would that be? Not Arizona, obviously.
No, not Arizona. I think of the states in the US, probably the most effective and balanced response that had the biggest return, I think, was Vermont. Hawaii had a lot of advantages being an island place. So I kind of take them off the table and say, I'm not going to count Hawaii. But there were a lot of states, Vermont included, that had good, Maine is another example. There were a lot of states that made good, responsible decisions, that thought through both the costs and benefits of the interventions that they were implementing. And ultimately, as I said, so much of this, the results are tied to the decisions that your governors make. And so that's what I'll say on states. Internationally, I'm not sure what to say about that. Australia was super effective at really doing a terrific job at limiting the spread, but also you have to think about, the economic and other costs that were imposed with they had stay-at-home orders like we had in March and April for like much of the last 2 years. And so, and that, it shows you that you got to think, in my opinion, you should be thinking not just about how do we save the most lives, but how do we save the most lives in a thoughtful way to make sure that we're balancing the risks and benefits of everything that we do. And it's a mistake to only think that your only goal, in my opinion, that your only goal is to limit mortality. Because if you're doing that, then you're not thinking through like what the costs of your interventions are. And that's where I think the difficult decisions lie for those governors that wanted to do a good job, is thinking about what is it that I can do risk benefit wise, which goes to masking, which universal masking, we knew going back to June 11th of 2020 was so effective, and the return on investment is off the charts, like the vaccine. The vaccine ROI is huge. Closing bars, restaurants, and nightclubs, that has a different calculus because you're putting people out of work, And so that's the way I think about it.
Okay. All right. So we're going to go ahead and Paul, we're gonna table it here. Got to cut the stream and then come back for additional questions if Will's willing to hang out. But before we wrap, are there any books, podcasts, websites you'd like to promote? And where can we find more information about you, sir?
Oh, so I have a blog, which I think you put in the chat at the very beginning. Our organization is called the Arizona Public Health Association. There it is right there. I do a new blog post just about every day. I'm trying to, let's see, what else did you ask? Podcasts. We do a Vitalist. Vitalist Health Foundation we've been doing podcasts every 2 weeks from the very beginning of this on the Vitalist Health Foundation. And so you can find those podcasts. We're going to do another one on Monday. It's me, Dr. LeBaire at ASU. We usually have a couple clinicians who work in emergency departments that are also on those podcasts. So you can look for the Vitalist Health Foundation podcasts around COVID-19, and you can listen to those. They're about an hour long, and we do them every 2 weeks.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. With that, I want to thank you for advocating for science and reason through this pandemic, sir. You have been a lifesaver for me personally, and I'm certain for many in the community. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Remember, if you enjoyed our content, please hit the subscribe button, contribute to our Patreon, become a member of HSGP, or better yet, volunteer to make the magic happen. With that, stay safe, be well, and take care. Goodbye, HSGP.